Joining us now to talk more is former Marine Intelligence Officer and host of the Strat podcast, Hal Kempfer. Great to see you again, Hal.
Great to see you, Anna.
So Israel's considering limiting the flow of humanitarian resources into Gaza in order to starve Hamas of resources. Do you think that's a viable strategy, or will it just make a dire situation even worse?
Well, Anna, it's obviously going to create a more dire situation for the residents of Gaza because there is, essentially starvation, but definitely food insecurity is a good way of putting it. We kind of put a red line this fall, the U.S. did, in terms of sending aid to Israel. We said, hey, you have to improve the amount of aid going into Gaza, food aid and other types of aid for the civilians there. And there was a slight improvement, not what I would consider a major improvement. And when the deadline for enforcing that came up, essentially, we didn't take action. We just let that deadline pass, and that was a miss. Now, President Trump is expressing skepticism, on this, and it's not seen that this is really slowing down Hamas. Hamas is recruiting individuals. And I think what Israel's concerned about is just so much of that aid is getting diverted over to directly and indirectly supporting Hamas,
right,
that they're feeling that this is needed.
Right. Well, Secretary of State Antony Blinken did sit down with the New York Times reporter Lulu Garcia-Navarro to discuss his tenure in office, and Blinken had this to say about that humanitarian aid.
When it comes, for example, to the provision of humanitarian assistance, we've found periods of time where, no, we didn't think they were doing enough. And this is exactly why, most recently with Secretary Austin, we pressed them very hard to take actions that would ensure that more assistance got to people.
And she questioned him. She sort of asked him the same question 3 times, and that was about the best answer she got. But do you agree with Secretary Blinken that Israel has not done enough at times to get aid into Gaza? I mean, as some in the international community have said, what Netanyahu is doing is war crimes.
It's a big question on war crimes and the law of war, but certainly it does look like Israel could do more to put more aid in there. Of course, the other problem is when they send the aid in, a lot of times those convoys get swarmed, everything gets taken off. A lot of that ends up going to Hamas. So there's a basic security and logistics issue of getting that aid to those who really need it that Israel's been trying to work through. So it's not really black and white per se. There's a lot of gray in there, but Israel could do more. But without the U.S. pressure, the question is, will Israel do as much as they've been doing? And that's where there's a lot of doubt.
Yeah, and when you see, the attacks still incoming from Israel into Gaza, and, Hamas is really on its heels, and there are estimates that 45,000 people have died. People have said, if you really want this ceasefire, maybe take your foot off the gas. But what Blinken said in this interview is anytime Israel seems to do that, then Hamas, when they're about to get to a deal, they walk away from it. Is that your assessment too?
From what I can tell, every time they get close to a deal, Hamas backs away. The problem Hamas has is there really isn't a way forward for them. As terms of a governing organization in Gaza, Israel's never going to agree to that. In terms of being a military force, they're not a traditional military force. They're still an insurgent force, but Israel's not going to agree to that, and they're not going to allow them to remain a threat like they were on October 7th. Hence, for Hamas, they're negotiating what really could be the functional end of Hamas, and that's where you see kind of a desperation on their part. When they get to the point where they could agree to something, they realize that after the ceasefire, there may not be a Hamas as they know it going forward, so they seem to back away. So both sides are doing a lot of pressure tactics around those negotiations.
And one more question before we get to Ukraine. The Biden administration on Friday has just pitched an $8 billion arms deal for Israel. So what message does this send when we criticize Israel one day for not allowing enough aid, but then the next send them billions in weapons?
Well, that's kind of what we've been doing all along. We criticize them, and then we go ahead and authorize more arms for them. But we have to look a little bit broader. It's not just Gaza. When we're sending weapons to Israel, we're not just looking at what's going on in Gaza. We're looking at what's going on north in Syria. We're looking at what's going on in the region with Iran. We're looking at the Houthi missiles coming in from Yemen. We're looking at a lot of regional some would say beyond regional security issues. And Israel is essentially a stalwart ally that we've had in the region, and they're keeping the pressure on Iran, and that's important not just for the region, that's important for things beyond the region, as in Iran's connection with Russia.
Yeah, well, the President-elect Donald Trump saying there will be hell to pay if the hostages don't come home. We'll see how things shift in a couple of weeks if the tide of war changes at all. Let's turn to Ukraine now, where since the start of the war, a variety of sanctions have been leveled against Russia, including ones against Russian banks, individual oligarchs, and the Russian oil industry. Now, these sanctions causing costs to rise in Russia, but the war in Ukraine has not stopped. So have the sanctions been effective, do you think?
They've been effective. I will say there's been a lot of criticism. This goes back even before the war in Ukraine. There's a lot of criticism that we over rely on sanctions, and we think sanctions are the perfect means, and sanctions are a way to avoid military action. Sanctions have limitations. I mean, there's some things, taking Russia off the SWIFT system, that was done early. That has had a huge impact. Going after banks, individuals, a variety of different things have been done since. Huge impact, but every time they do that, Russia finds a way to circumvent it. It's a dark fleet, if you will, of tankers, very dangerous tankers, unsafe tankers in congested waterways, all sorts of different ways they've been doing this. So there's a lot of questions as to whether sanctions are really something we should rely upon. Maybe we should use another tool.
All right. Well, Blinken, in that same interview with the New York Times, said this about the war in Ukraine.
What we've left is Ukraine, which was not self-evident, because Putin's ambition was to erase it from the map. We stopped that. Putin has failed. His strategic objective in regaining Ukraine has failed and will not succeed.
Do you agree? How do you think Ukraine's doing right now?
Well, I would say compared to what Putin wanted to accomplish initially, oh yeah, they have failed. They have taken phenomenal losses. They are digging into old USSR war stocks for tanks and armored personnel carriers, artillery systems. They have just suffered enormous attrition. The Ukrainian military is saying that up to about 800,000 Russians have died in this war. So yeah, they make marginal gains. In the Donbass, they're making marginal gains on the battlefield at horrific costs. In Kursk, surprisingly, the Ukrainians are actually using a counteroffensive and actually making some gains against the Russians. That just happened. So overall, the Ukrainians, they've got a really tough road. Obviously, the Russia's much bigger than Ukraine, but they have stopped them from doing what they want to do. The question is, what will the map look like whenever the war stops? And that's what we're really looking at, with the next administration.
And how will they get to a place where they're able to remain on the map and able to remain and keep their territory, even if the fighting ends? Who's to say it's not going to start back up once again? Former Marine Intelligence Officer Hal Kempfer, thank you so much for joining us. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Anna.